This presentation of In Their Own Words is dedicated to the brave men and women of the United States Armed Forces. In 1944, the Allies fought their way from the beaches of Normandy towards German soil. Their sights were firmly set on pushing all the way to Hitler's capital, Berlin, and putting an end to World War II. Success in Europe required soldiers with a wide variety of skills. Robert Weiss was a U.S. Army forward observer. His mission was to move ahead of the troops and find targets for the artillery. But being out in front placed him closer to the enemy and at greater risk of being cut off from his comrades. His harrowing experiences were chronicled in his book, Enemy, North, South, East, West. The following is an in-depth interview with Robert Weiss. These are his experiences in his own words.
How did you find yourself a lieutenant in the Army?
I had gone to Purdue University and was in ROTC there when the war came along. We were kept in school in the ROTC. Our school schedule was accelerated, and we graduated in December of 1942 and were shipped off to Fort Sill for Officers Candidate School because the acceleration had prohibited summer camp, and the Army felt that OCS was a good thing, and it probably was. So upon the completion of that 90-day experience, I was commissioned a second lieutenant.
How did you end up in the artillery and a forward observer? Did you know what it was?
Purdue was a field artillery unit. It was a very large ROTC at that time, and I just was automatically destined to be in the field artillery because I'd gone to school there. Forward observers, we had very little notion about that, although we learned a great deal at Fort Sill, and the training there was very excellent, very, very good.
What were your first thoughts when they said, okay, Bob, you're going to be a forward observer? And you said, you mean I have to be out front?
Well, I probably never thought of it that way because, for one thing, I didn't have any knowledge or any experience of what that might be. I know now, for example, from, say, correspondence that I've had with John Keegan, who's the great military historian in England, whose father was a forward observer in World War I, that experience was just being in a position that was not mobile, connected by wire, and sending in information by Morse code. And that was about all anybody knew about, at least I would have known about at that time. And things like the portable radio, which made the artillery in World War II totally different than it had ever been before, in my judgment. Things like that were just emerging. So when I was in school at Purdue, we didn't know anything about radios. We had French 75s from World War I, and the experience of 105 howitzers that, of course, was a predominant weapon in World War II was just unknown to us. Those were things we had to learn.
And sometimes it was seat of the pants learning, right?
Oh, yeah. Seat of the pants or elsewhere. Sure.
So the radio was, if you had to single out one thing that made the forward observer's job different in World War II, it would be the radio.
Oh, no question about it. No question about it, because the radios, although they were extremely heavy, radio weighed about 35 pounds, and then there was a battery. It was, this big, and a battery pack that was a similar size, approximately the same weight. Those were very high-quality pieces of equipment, and we packed them with us whenever we could, and it enabled the forward observer to be up there on the front lines with an infantryman, except instead of packing an M1 or a BAR or something like that, I had a whole battalion of artillery that I could shoot with. So Yeah, it was extremely important, and you contrast that with any other war where that capability didn't exist, and the artillery was essentially either direct fire, like in the Civil War where they'd roll the guns out and aim them at Pickett when he was charging or something of that sort, or World War I where they communicated by wire but from static positions. So we were able to move with the infantry, fight with them, and except for not shouldering a rifle, we had our artillery instead, which was pretty lethal.
Yeah.
And the infantry loved it.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
And they knew about it.
Well, they knew we were there, and that always gave them assurance.
What was it like landing? I mean, you were a few days after the original D-Day invasion, but it must have been early on that you hit the beach.
Well, it was in July, and that was an interesting experience. We came from England on an LCI, a landing craft infantry, as it was designated. I was the first one off the boat. My wife says that shows how foolish I was, but I was pretty gung-ho, and I remember the landing craft, the LCI, had ramps that came down, and they'd been underwater all night as we crossed the channel, so they were wet and slippery. I hadn't taken that into account, and with a full pack on my back, I almost went on my head, but fortunately I recovered and waved everybody else to get off the boat and let's get going.
And there wasn't a lot of incoming artillery from the Germans at this point?
Not at that point. Not at that point. No, we were many miles behind the front lines at that point.
Tell me about 314 and when you first went up it. Describe that.
Well, I'll back up just a little bit. The American forces had fought hedgerow by hedgerow, literally small field by small field to St. Lo in Normandy. And then there was the big bombing, which there's a lot of dispute about, and the breakthrough. And Bradley, who was in charge, was looking for a breakout. And at that point, he put Patton into action, the Third Army. Patton went south and west into Brittany, and then started to go east in what could have developed into a large enveloping movement. As Patton was starting that, the other American forces, the First Army, moved south, and they went as far south as a little town called Mortain, or as the Americans said, Mortain. And Mortain is about 20 miles east of fabled Mont Saint-Michel. In fact, you can see it from there. And just east of the town of Mortain, there's a very high hill, Hill 314. 314 means that the hill was 314 meters above sea level. Although there's been a lot of dispute about that. The British had maps that said it was 317 meters above, and some of the historians have followed those maps and called Hill 317. And in fact, the current French maps have it at 322 meters. But those who were there and all of the records of that event refer to it as Hill 314. The information that we had was that the Germans were in full retreat. We took over, the 30th Division, took over positions from the 1st Division, the big red one, and one battalion of the 30th Division of the 120th Infantry Regiment was sent up on Hill 314. It was a high point, a good defensive position, well above the town, and I was assigned to them as a forward observer. What we didn't know was that the Germans had planned a major counteroffensive with orders that really came directly from Hitler. There was no turning back for the German field marshals on that, and they assembled all the forces they could for what turned out to be the biggest German counterattack in France in World War II. Now you have to bear in mind the bulge was larger, but that was not in France. That was in Belgium and Luxembourg. And the attack had as its strategic objective to cut the American forces in two, to drive through to the sea at near Mont Saint-Michel, and to separate Patton from supply and support. The battle was a pretty extensive battle. Largely, the brunt of that was largely borne by the 30th Infantry Division. But in that battle, this one battalion was surprised, of course, as the entire division was surrounded for 6 days by the 2nd SS Panzer Division and by another SS unit called Comp Group Fick. And we awoke the morning after the attack started to find ourselves surrounded with only rifles, a bazooka with our infantry company had 9 rounds, no anti-tank mines, virtually no medical supplies, no food except what had been left us the night before. And the radio that I had and that another lieutenant had, his radio, however, went out the second day, and from then on, my radio became the only means of communication between that battalion and the forces to the rear. And so we sat there for 6 days, and I say slugged it out. That's perhaps an overstatement, but the infantry stood their ground, fired their few rounds of bazooka ammunition. They had few mortars, one of which didn't work. Machine gun ammunition was all in the valley to the rear where the Germans were. And as the infantry commander that I was assigned to and who bore the brunt of the battle later wrote, if it hadn't been for the artillery, why, we would have either been captured or destroyed. So that that describes a very unusual event.
It's sort of amazing that you guys held out as long as you did. But from a strategic standpoint, for people who have no clue about battles and warfare, describe the value of that place, of 314, to the reason the Americans wanted to hold it, or went up there in the first place, and the reasons the Germans were so insistent on trying to take it.
Well, I'll do the best I can with that. There's some dispute about the value of it, but I think has largely been settled. First of all, it was a place from which we had virtually unlimited observation of the Germans, and had they in turn occupied that hill, they would have certainly forced us to do very different things, because they would have had the same observation on us, except we would have been coming from a different direction. So it had that kind of tactical and perhaps strategic importance.
So you could see, I
could see for miles to the south and to the southeast, as far as it was possible to see to the east. We didn't have much visibility to the north, but that wasn't a problem. And to the west, to our rear, again, it didn't make much difference, because within 400 or 500 yards there were Germans that had surrounded us, and immediately behind them there were some palisades, some very high escarpments that came up from the town below. So it was a very, very important place. Strategically, what it did in the battle, I think, is this, and there's a book coming out that I believe supports that. The Germans had essentially lost that battle after 2 or 3 days, but they continued to pound the hill. We were under blistering artillery fire, tank fire, you name it, for the entire period. And there seems to be no question that it diverted resources that the Germans otherwise would have used in their attempt to break through to the sea. For example, there were very few tanks that they had in reserve, that is, to hold in a position where they could be used if some unannounced event took place. So they had very few tanks in reserve. However, we were constantly being attacked by tanks, and there's no question in my mind that that meant that they diverted tanks from their main objective to Hill 314. I think also Hill 314 was a symbolic thing with them. They couldn't believe that a little battalion of 650 men with virtually no weapons could hold out against the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, which was one of Hitler's favorite and most seasoned divisions. So there was that element too, which I think probably enticed them to withdraw forces from other parts of the battle where they might have been used more advantageously. Because, realistically, they could have just let it evolve into a stalemate, and we would have sat on the hill, and they would have kept their position around us, and they could have used those forces elsewhere. But they didn't, and I think it had a significant effect on their success.
Describe first going up there. I mean, did you think, as I interviewed another forward observer, who wasn't in World War II, much later, but he said he'd been to Hill 314, and he looked around and he said it was sort of a forward observer's dream position because of the unlimited view it provided of the valley area.
Well, that's a very interesting thing, because if you go there today, there is no view. And the reason there's no view is all these little pine trees have grown up and obscured the view. When we were there in August of 1944, we could see for miles and in all directions that were pertinent. And if we hadn't been able to see, there isn't any question that you and I wouldn't be having this interview. But one of the interesting things is that I have a map or a copy of a map in color that was sent to me by a woman who did a translation of my book into French. It's a map dated 1909, and it shows that whole area as having been forested. So you have the peculiar circumstance. 1909, there are trees there. 1942, it's as if a curtain opened up, and you could see. That's 35 years later, and then you push it ahead to 1990 or 2000, the current date, and you can't see again, and it's almost providential. One friend of mine surmises that probably during the Depression, the French farmers cut the trees down for firewood, but for whatever reason, 35 years before, you couldn't see. 35 years afterwards, you couldn't see, but at that time, you could. So it's a remarkable thing.
Yeah. Well, when did you first realize, as the counterattack of the Germans was underway, when did the realization sink in? It's like,
not until the morning. We went up on the hill August the 6th. The counterattack began after midnight, but where we were, we knew things were happening, and I had called in some artillery fire to protect our position. We knew there was some kind of an attack going on, but it wasn't until the following morning that we became aware that we were totally surrounded. And of course, that following morning, dawn found us in a fog, a very heavy, dense fog.
And how did you figure out that you were surrounded? What gave that away? When the fog lifted, you could see, or?
Well, how do you know? How do you know when
how that realization?
How do you know when you're surrounded? Well, For one thing, H Company, which was our heavy weapons company, was on the south slope of the hill. They had been completely overrun by the Germans as they came around the hill. A few stragglers from there came up and joined our people, so we knew at that point, of course, that the Germans were immediately to our south. One of the companies to our rear had changed its position because they had been overrun, or at least involved in a heavy firefight during the night, and had to move in closer to E Company, where I was, consolidate, get a tighter defensive line. So we knew that they were at our rear. And of course, to our front, as soon as that fog lifted, it was pretty obvious because there was wave after wave of infantry and tanks and you name it coming our way. And in fact, that first morning, I had an observation post up there, and I was quite humbled as a fledgling at that business to be shot out of that observation post by machine gun fire. So we knew a lot of things were happening.
Do you remember the first fire mission you called in from up there?
Yeah, I remember the first fire mission. It was the night before, actually. It was a pleasant afternoon, and my staff sergeant, John Korn, who was killed there, was fiddling with a battery commander's telescope, a BC scope, which is a high power, as I recall, 20 power scope. And he looked through that, and he turned to me and he said, "Lieutenant, would you like to shoot some Jerry's?" And that was the first fire mission, and we shot them, of course.
And the next day, when the fog lifted and you could see the Germans, and you called in missions then, obviously.
Oh, lots of them, and as I say, at that first observation post, I called in a number of them. Then I was shot out of that post, and we had to move to the very high point of the hill, and we stayed there for a couple of days or so, and then we eventually moved to another observation post. So we moved to wherever we had the best visibility or where circumstances demanded that we be.
What was it like to spot a target, radio in, and then see the shells and see the impact? It must be an interesting sense of power and actually, in some sense of accomplishment when you're able to fire on people who are firing on you.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a sense of exhilaration that you get from that. I suppose it's like somebody who goes to a target range, and if you hit the bullseye, yay. But as events developed, it became very hazardous. We had 40% casualties up there, which is a very high rate. And so there was an air of desperation that also went with the exhilaration, and it was a great feeling to be shooting back and to know that you were destroying an enemy that was bent on destroying you. But it was overshadowed by the notion that it was life or death.
That was the primary thought: get them, or they're going to get us.
Well, I think so. Different people have different views of death. I don't think I ever dwelled much about my own circumstances that way, but I know other people did, and it was certainly in the air, no question about it. And of course, the casualty rate was extremely high, and what the infantry commanders did, which was extremely intelligent, was to take the bodies each day and put them in a place where they couldn't be seen, just as a way of keeping the morale up. Because if you're lying there next to somebody you've been marching and fighting with, and he's suddenly dead, that's going to take a lot out of you. So there was all of that, plus the fact that we had no food and the medical supplies were virtually non-existent. So if somebody was injured, the medico the aid man would come, but there was nothing he could really do. So it had a had an overlayment of desperation, I think, is maybe the right word.
So tell me, because not everybody understands the way this works with forward observers and artillery. So you're in an observation post, you're looking out into the valley, and you see part of the 2nd Panzer Division, you see tanks, or you see this. Describe the whole process of one particular, or what in those circumstances would be a normal situation.
Well, okay, I'm there. I have my binoculars up. I'm peering away, and I spot some tanks. The process there at that time, it's changed, of course, substantially with more modern technology, but the process at that time was that I would decide where that tank unit or those tanks were on a map. Now, the maps weren't all that accurate. They were charts that had, as we know from the legends on them, taken from Michelin road maps, so they had to be used with some caution. But I would decide what the coordinates were, so it took some skill to read the terrain and then relate it to the map. I would call fire mission. My radio operator would turn the radio on. He would say fire mission, which connected us to our fire direction center, where there were a whole group of people, and we would send the coordinates, sometimes in code, but in the fast-moving situation, not in code, because you couldn't wait for all of that. And the people back there would plot it. They would figure out what elevation and what powder charge and what direction, what azimuth the guns had to be pointed at in order to hit the target, and they would fire. And then I would see smoke out there where the shells had landed. If the shells had gone too far, they were over the target. If they were not far enough, they were short. Those were the technical terms. And I would give an adjusting command. So if, for example, I thought the shell hit 200 yards beyond the target, I would say 200 over, 100 left, or something like that. And they would then give a correcting command. That would go through the radio. The fire direction center would give commands to the guns, and they would shoot again. And so a lot of it depended on how accurately I could position the target in the first place, because once you're out there, say you're a German tank, and if a shell comes fairly close, you're going to move. And so speed and accuracy were essential.
Do you remember specific instances of looking through the binoculars and seeing shells you called in land on German tanks, or land specifically on German artillery?
Well, I suppose the most vivid event I recall is we had been under fire from white phosphorus shells, and they're quite terrifying. And they're largely used for identifying a target or a point by the smoke that comes up from them, but also for incendiary purposes. And when they would explode, these minute particles of white phosphorus came showering down on everybody that was there, and fortunately it didn't last very long. And I was sitting there on top of the hill behind a rock, pondering the situation, and it seemed to me that something had to be done. And the finger kind of pointed at me, because there wasn't anybody else who could do anything. And So I thought through the ramifications of whether or not the Germans could hit me with artillery fire if they saw me on top of the hill. Obviously, I wasn't going to stand up and wave at them, but at 1,000 or 1,500 yards, a mile or so with binoculars, they could clearly see me if I was up there, and I concluded that the risk was minimal, so I crawled up there, and they started shooting, and I saw a self-propelled battery of guns. And by that time, which was several days into it, the topographic features out there were, as far as I was concerned, just numbers on a map. So I could pinpoint them quite accurately. I called in fire mission, and we knocked out I think something like 14 or 16 guns in the course of a few hours by that tactic, and it was very satisfying. And I'm also the opinion that probably it knocked out a great deal of the assault weapons, and by that I mean artillery, that the Germans had available to use against us there on the hill.
So are you watching through the binoculars, and you can describe what you can actually see after you call in a mission?
Well, you've looked through binoculars yourself, of course, and you have a very narrow field of view. You see the guns out there that represent your target or the tank, and there'll be a cloud of black smoke that will come up. Usually the initial firing took place with one or two guns to conserve ammunition, and if you see the target in front of the cloud of smoke, obviously the shell has gone too far, and if it's the other way around, it's short. And so you make an adjustment, and when you think you're awfully close, as I thought we were in many of those cases, I'd call for fire for effect almost instantly, which meant that the whole battalion of 12 105s would be firing with the shells converging on that target all at one time, and so the artillery became very devastating, and we silenced a lot of artillery weapons and tanks up there.
Must have been nice to be able to look through, though, and say bullseye.
Yeah, it was nice, but you also had to take into account that no matter how charmed you thought your life might be, it wasn't going to last forever, and in that particular instance, after I'd done all the shooting that I thought it was healthy to do, I found a safer position.
Well, forward observers are at risk, I would think, to a greater degree than a lot of other people, because the enemy knows that without a forward observer, the artillery has no eyes and ears.
Yeah, the casualty rate of forward observers was very high. And during World War II, I believe the Germans used radio direction finders so that they could sense where a forward observer was. And I know Lieutenant Curley, who was the infantry commander there, felt early on that was happening. My radio operator was sure that was happening. And in fact, the antenna, the telescoping antenna on our radio was shot off by an 88. So whether that was chance or intentional, I don't know, but it did happen.
Well, you had one 88 shell land right next to you, didn't you? Tell me that story.
Well, I had that was very early on in the siege at Mortain. I had sent my entire crew, 3 men. Well, 2 of them I'd sent looking for batteries, because it was obvious once we were surrounded that the only way we were going to communicate was with our radio, and that relied on batteries, and we only had 2 sets. And I'd sent them to see if they could find a way back, and then when they hadn't appeared, I'd sent the 3rd man to find them. So I was by myself on top of the high point, and an 88 came in, hit, I'm going to say 20 or 25 feet away from where I was, hit a boulder, knocked a chunk of the boulder off, chunk about the size of a baseball or maybe a little bigger. The chunk of the boulder flew over and hit my arm, but the shell didn't explode, and it ricocheted off and went whistling down into the valley behind us and exploded down there. And so that, if that's the experience you have reference to, we called it Polish ammunition, meaning that some well-intentioned Polish enslaved worker that had been enslaved by the Germans had armed that shell defectively, and so, sometimes you're lucky.
And you were wearing a special shirt.
My father had been a captain in the Engineer Corps in World War I, and he had this beautiful shirt that had been specially tailored for him. And his regret, I'm sure, was that although he was active in France for a long time, he never saw combat. And so I wore the shirt for a while, and I wore it at that battle. And I suppose as much as anything to say to my father that if at least he hadn't gone to combat, why his shirt did.
It's those sort of personal totems. Did that help you through what must have been a horrific time with no food, no water, completely surrounded? It wasn't a camping trip.
Wasn't a camping trip, and the shirt without doubt lent support. No question about it.
So how many days total were you surrounded on the hill?
6 days.
And were there moments where you thought, this is it, nobody's coming for us?
Well, I didn't worry about that. I was too busy. In the period of time that I was up there, I shot 193 fire missions, which is about one every 45 minutes. And so I didn't worry much about personal security. But certainly that was an issue, and towards the end, I felt that due to some misunderstandings in our communication, because we always tried to put on a good face, a brave front. I felt that the people at the rear didn't understand how desperate our situation was, and so I did send a radio message in which I expressed the opinion that if we didn't get reinforcements, we wouldn't be able to hold out. I didn't phrase it negatively that way. What I stated was that with reinforcements we could hold out, but the implication was if we didn't get them, why we're dead or prisoners. And that evoked a response from the division commanders, I found out 50 years later.
The battery situation was traumatic. What bit of improvisation did you guys come up with to extend the battery life?
Well, my radio operator, Sergeant Sasser of North Carolina, conceived that was going to be a real problem right on. It was August, of course. The weather was quite good. And he immediately began to, we had 2 sets of batteries, as I said before, and he began to replace the batteries very regularly. And when he'd take a set of batteries out of the battery pack, he would put them in the sun where they would warm. And, if you've ever tried to start a car engine in cold weather, why, it's a lot easier if your car's been in the garage or you have a battery heater or something of that sort. So that was done on a regular basis. We kept the radio turned off when we weren't communicating, and by some magical stroke, the batteries continued to function up until the very end. At the very end, as I know now, we could send a signal, but we couldn't receive. And I've often again thought it was very providential, because if it had been the other way around, the radio would have been worthless.
It's almost like a Hanukkah miracle, the radios that lasted 6 days,
yeah,
the batteries.
Right. Yeah, there were a number of things that were providential.
With the busy fall season just around the corner, you might be looking for wholesome, convenient meals for jam-packed days. Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit, can help you fuel up fast with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door. You'll save time, eat well, and stay on track with your healthy lifestyle. Too busy with your end-of-summer goals to cook but want to make sure you're eating well? With Factor, skip the extra trip to the grocery store and the chopping, prepping, and cleaning up too, while still getting the flavor and nutritional quality you need. Factor's fresh, never-frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes, so all you have to do is heat and enjoy, then get back to crushing your goals. Level up with Gourmet Plus options prepared to perfection by chefs and ready to eat in record time. Treat yourself to upscale meals with premium ingredients like broccolini, leeks, truffle butter, and asparagus. With Factor, you can rest assured you're making a sustainable choice. We offset 100% of our delivery emissions, source 100% renewable electricity for our production sites and offices, and feature sustainably sourced seafood in our meals. This August, get Factor and enjoy eating well without the hassle. Simply choose your meals and enjoy fresh, flavor-packed meals delivered to your door, ready in just 2 minutes, no prep, no mess. Head to factormeals.com/warriors50 and use code warriors50 to get 50% off. That's code warriors50 at factormeals.com/warriors50 to get 50% off.
Describe. I mean, I guess I just want people to know that it wasn't, you weren't on a camping trip, and that it was sort of 24 hours of hell for 6 days in a row, and of constant, work, if not worry. And one of the worries was food and water, I guess.
Well, we had the first night we were up there, which was before the attack began. The infantry delivered by jeep a hot meal to everybody, and I think one K ration, or maybe two. And as the artillery, our people had an extra K ration or two, which we'd squirreled away in our gas mask carriers or someplace else. But apart from that, we had very little food. At first, we didn't have any water, and finally, someone found a farmhouse that was right in the middle of this area. And when I say the hill, it's not a pointy hill like a dunce cap, but it was a plateau that was probably a mile long and 600 or 800 yards wide, with a ridge at each end, or at the east side and the west side. And right in the middle of that was a farmhouse that had been there forever, and it's still there. And so they'd send patrols. They'd gather up all the canteens that they could find, string them together, and fill them up. Nobody much cared whose canteen he got back. We we weren't worried about foot and mouth disease or anything like that. So we did have water after about the second day. There were, I know a man who caught a hare, and there were a few chickens, and one day somebody handed me a big rutabaga to eat, which I ate, but never again. It was tasteless, and I'm sure had no calories, no nutrition in it. So I think I describe in the book that one day 5 of us shared. This was our total food for the day. We shared one D ration, which is a little chocolate bar about that big, which would normally be a snack for one person. And that was our total food for the day. And in having that, we had more food than probably most other men up there.
It's remarkable that under those circumstances you're able to function effectively and in a lethal way, because to beat back, to hold off.
Well, there was a great sense of determination that spread among all the people that were up there, and I think a lot of that is attributable to the leadership of people like Ralph Curley, who was the infantry commander of E Company, and the other company commanders too, Woody and the commander of Company K.
And forward observers, you think they are appreciated within the military? Because it's in some cases it seems like my sense is they're often overlooked.
Well, I think in my experience in World War II is that I can't speak for current times, but in World War II, the infantry just loved having the artillery around, and sometimes we would be assigned to an infantry unit, I felt at least, just to make them feel good, because it gave them a sense of assurance. And you have to remember that there are very few riflemen that actually shot anybody. Most of the damage was done by artillery or bombing, and in some cases, or mortar fire, and machine gun fire perhaps. But the artillery, it told the rifleman, gee, here are 12 105 millimeter howitzers or more, because our battalion could, if need be, call in other units. In our division, we had 3 such battalions, so that's 36 guns plus a battalion of medium howitzers, 8-inchers as I recall, and that's a lot of firepower if need be.
Well, when the day finally came and the battle of that hill was over, that must have been a wonderful moment.
Well, it was, and it wasn't. One of the reasons it wasn't was because my chief of detail, Sergeant Korn, was killed that morning, and that again was was a circumstance where I was extremely lucky. He and I were sharing a foxhole, a very shallow foxhole, where we sat facing each other with our legs intertwined, and I moved from that position to the radio, which was 15 yards away maybe, to send in a fire mission. And while I did that, a large shell came in and hit in that foxhole exactly where I'd been sitting, and it virtually blew one of his legs off, and he died later that morning. So there was there was a great sadness that affected us all because of that. And then I think after 6 days of that kind of an experience, you're just totally wrung out, and the combination of those things tended to depress any feeling of elation that we might otherwise have had. So
a shell came in. What happened? When you crawled away to make radio in a fire mission?
I crawled up to the OP to radio in a fire mission. The OP was just up the hill a few yards, and a shell came in. We don't know from where. It could have been from the rear. It could have been a German tank firing. It could have been friendly fire. But we've always just made the best assumption, which is that it was enemy fire, and the foxhole was, I don't know, 4 feet long maybe, and there were 2 of us in there, one sitting at each end, and it hit the end where I had been sitting. And I heard the shell from where I was, but it was just another shell in the total number that we'd been hearing all those days. And then one of the other two men came running up to me, and he said, Sergeant Korn's been hit. And so he survived for about 3 or 4 hours, but we had no way of treating him. I used his belt as a tourniquet, but that was the best we had.
And then he died. And that, in those instances, it's good the battle's going on a little longer, so you don't sit there and ponder the fact that 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, that's certainly true, because while I was the two men that were with me were having a very difficult time with this, and that was a luxury I couldn't afford. And they had moved him meanwhile up to the OP, and I was sitting there regularly loosening and then tightening the belt tourniquet. And at the same time, I was sending in fire missions. And of course, as I said before, at that point we couldn't hear anything, but we knew that the fire missions were effective because we could see the shell fire out there. So it was the fire missions were what kept me from dwelling on Korn any more than I otherwise would have, although it was a very, very sad event.
What are the sounds like? I mean, was there the raging battle of shells and machine gun fire and snipers? Was the air full of noise?
At that time? Oh, it was absolutely deafening. Absolutely deafening, yes.
What kind of sounds?
Well, imagine an explosion. Most people have heard some kind of an explosion, and magnify that many times. And it was not only the explosion of shells, but the Germans at that point were in serious retreat. And so there was all the rumble of tanks and other vehicles on the road. There was a lot of dust out there. I recall the dust rising up off of the road in the glare of the early morning sunlight, because, we're looking at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning and on into about 8 or 9. By noon, I think we had been relieved, but during that interim period, it was still, as far as we knew, the battle was still on.
And machine gun fire, sniper fire?
I don't recall any of that at that point, but there was plenty of that during the time that we were up there. One night, the Germans, not being successful with their tanks and artillery, attacked us from the rear with machine guns and rifle fire, and they just came charging across that field, and it was impossible to direct any artillery fire at them because of the danger of hitting our own men. And so the riflemen, just fired back and fired as hard as they could at those spots of light in the dark. One man lying right next to me was hit in the head and died. It could have been me, but it wasn't, fortunately. And the Germans called off their attack and went back because they hadn't been successful. But again, we had tanks in our positions several times. We had the infantry on that attack, and if they had persisted, I have no doubt they would have overrun the battalion.
Is this something you think about every day, or is this something that you sort of put aside and call up now and then? Or is this with you always?
Well, I had pretty much put it aside before I wrote the book, and it's only when guys like you talk to me about it that it gets called up. But unfortunately, that's a lot of times now.
You've been back, though. You went back?
Yeah, I went back the first time in '83, and then I was back in I think 1994. Not for the D-Day ceremonies, but shortly before that. And then in September of 1999, Mortain put on a 55th anniversary celebration of the battle. And that was a remarkable thing. This little town of 2,000 people, which was virtually obliterated by the battle, reconstructed since, but still a very teeny little place, put on this huge celebration that went on all day and well into the night, with speeches in the morning downtown, and the roads completely blocked, children with flowers and flags, and the whole town turned out. And then we went up to the hill, and there were speeches in French and then English translations, and a few English speeches, and they were translated into French, and bands, and we had a Van d'honneur, which is a reception for honorary guests, and that was in a central meeting hall in the town, and there was champagne there, and diplomas for the veterans, and there were about 30 of us that were there. And then that evening we had to come back for another big dinner, and that went on with a jazz band until after midnight. And after midnight, a doctor took us to his home with some friends, and we talked till the wee hours of the morning. And of course, the Mortain taxpayers were paying for all of this. But it was such an outpouring of gratitude and good feeling, and it encompassed, I think, 4 generations of the French, and because they have passed that on, to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and here are these wee kids that are out there waving their flags and throwing flowers at us. So they don't forget.
Neither do you.
Well, it's wonderful to be with people who have that sense of feeling and gratitude and understanding of what freedom and liberty mean.
It's not something given to you. You have to earn it.
It's not given to you, and I think until you've lost it, you don't appreciate it.
And the French do.
Well, certainly the people at Mortain do, yes. I think the French generally are very, very appreciative.
And you, as someone who helped fight for it, has a strong feeling. I mean, you have a strong feeling for that.
Well, I consider it a privilege to been able to to participate in that event. Yes.
Many lives were lost pushing the German Reich back into the rubble of Berlin. It is to those courageous men that we owe our freedom today, won at so high a cost in the assault on Germany. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation of In Their Own Words. This program was created and produced by First Person Productions Incorporated in association with the Documentary Broadcasting Company. Produced by David Benson. Written by Rod Pyle. Engineered by Greg Bartheld and Brian Donovan. Narrated by Bill Ratner. This production is copywritten by First Person Productions Incorporated. Any unauthorized broadcast, public performance, or copying is a violation of applicable laws.
Step back in time and discover the untold stories of history's greatest heroes. From ancient civilizations to modern times, the Anthology of Heroes podcast takes you on a journey through history, uncovering the bravery and determination of those who stood up for what they believed in. These aren't just stories from old history books, they're the human experiences of those who fought for justice, freedom, and their principles. From the defiance of Vercingetorix as he stood against Rome, to the unwavering spirit of Skanderbeg as he faced down the Ottoman Empire, each episode is a journey through their life as we follow their triumphs and their failures. Meticulously researched with quotes and observations from primary sources, Anthology of Heroes is the perfect blend of expert research and engaging storytelling. So listen and subscribe now on your favorite podcasting app.